Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Wednesday, August 19th, 2020. And today I want to again talk about some fake constitution supporters. We get a lot of them out there. People who claim to love the founders, people who claim to support the Constitution, but absolutely lose it whenever they hear about a limited or even modest foreign policy or any effort to do even a tiny reduction in military spending. To me, these people are the absolute worst. So I'm going to cite George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, Thomas Paine, Samuel Adams, James Wilson, and probably a few others. For me, this is just a no-brainer, and I'll get to that a little bit later as well. But first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage, which just got a kind of a moderate revamp yesterday, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, all spelled out. There you're going to find everything. All the previous episodes that we've done. On individual episodes, I include links in the show notes for you to read and learn more on your own time. We've got all the different platforms, both video platforms, live streaming, and archive, and then the audio-only podcast edition, iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, and elsewhere. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And I can't forget, you can also find our membership program. So if you really want to support us financially, put your financial faith behind our work, don't feel any pressure to do that, but I'm very grateful for those of you who either are already doing that or are considering doing that in the near future. It starts out as little as $2 a month. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. A quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I'm very grateful for you being here with me today. Thank you very much. Political Brew over on Periscope. Hey, from Tyler. Good to see you, buddy. Shane Lackey, Dan Reed, Funky Euphemism, MRGF78, Melody Skaman, Lauren Smith, Jeff Stewart. Hey, it's that time. Hey, everybody. Bob Landry in San Antonio, Pro-Life, Pro-Liberty in Austin, Funky Euphemism. Always good to see you, as well as Justin Morrison, Tyler B., Tim Martin, Patricia Dance, Alan Mosley, and everyone else. And Dan Reed's site looks great. Getting there. I'm actually, what I thought was kind of cool in there is it makes it really easy to find all the platforms we're on right near the top of the page below the current episode of the most recent episode from the archive. But then as you scroll down the page, I've put some sections of specific categories because a lot of people say, oh, I like this episode on the right to keep and bear arms. Have you done others? So I'm going to keep adding that. I've got 10th Amendment, I've got surveillance, I've got police state and the right to keep and bear arms. But certainly we're going to include things like the founders, foreign policy, and things like that as well. Anyways, let's get to this. And I want to start it out here by pointing out that we did this episode on the 14th, so just last week, Friday, called Defund the Pentagon. It's a spin on another defund phrase that's been going out there, but what I wanted to talk about in that episode was the fact that the U.S. government, the largest government in the history of the planet, is constantly increasing the amount of money it spends all across the board, and one of them pretty regularly is on military spending. The most recent National Defense Authorization Act, which hasn't been finalized, but it will be at some point because it's always must pass. They never reject passing these things because we can't rely on government to limit its own power. But the most recent effort right now that's pending would make the U.S. military budget approximately as much or more than the next 11 countries combined. So in response to that, anytime we talk about something like that, or we talk about foreign policy and relate it to the founders, whenever we quote the founders on war and foreign policy, we get right-wingers going absolutely nuts, telling us we're propagandists, liars, we're bad, we're dangerous, and on and on and on. If there's any cutting back on the biggest government in history spending on military, even a 10% reduction, we're told that China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, they're going to be invading the United States. They'll be at our shores and making us slaves. These are real quotes, and we get them all the time by email and comments and the like. Or if we point out some quotes from James Madison, the father of the Constitution, the response is that we're spreading communist propaganda. Now, this isn't anything new under the current administration. We had different things under the previous one. Generally, we were told that we were racist or neo-Confederate. But when it comes to foreign policy, the one before that, if we cited George Washington or James Madison or Thomas Jefferson or said we needed a declaration of war before going into Iraq, we were told that we should move to Cuba, go be with the commies in Cuba. Or why do you hate America? We're consistently called America haters. So this is nothing new, but it made me remember this article that Mike Meharry, who just celebrated, I'm not sure the exact date, but he just celebrated his 11-year anniversary with the 10th Amendment Center. Pretty amazing. Thank you so much. Mike has done over 3,000 articles and blogs on our website. The guy is an absolute machine when it comes to blogging, writing, researching, reporting, and the like. And he wrote this article in his early days in November of 2011. And the title was, "I Love George Washington, Except for His Foreign Policy." And he was talking about how he made a transition from being a neocon warmonger pig, basically someone who rejected the founders' view, maybe because he didn't know it originally, or he fell into the propaganda machine that said that no matter how big the U.S. military establishment is, it's not big enough. It's got to be bigger and bigger and bigger. We're all size queens, I guess, when it comes to military. Well, not me. I'm comfortable. So George Washington, he says, I love George Washington except his foreign policy. So he went from neocon to constitutionalist, or whatever we want to call him at that stage. And he pointed out that people that were his friends or people that he knew would just get so angry. And it's some of the most vile attacks that we get from anybody, worse than the Rachel Maddows or the Southern Poverty Law Centers of the world, when you talk about limiting foreign policy, restricting foreign policy to a constitutional approach or that of George Washington. And Mike had a really interesting warm up on that, and he led into George Washington's famous farewell address. I will link to that in the show notes so you can read his full article. Another episode like this that we experienced was Tom Woods. He spoke at the Nullifying Now Los Angeles speech event in May of that same year. Let me see when Mike wrote that. Mike wrote that in November, so maybe it was inspired by Tom. But Tom, he had spoken at a number of our events. And Tom has been a great friend of the TAC and me personally for a long, long time. And he talked about how he was also a kind of just a standard Republican, buying into the establishment propaganda garbage. But at some point, he recognized that if you're arguing that government is too big, it's inefficient, it's bad at what it does, it lies on every domestic policy, why does that suddenly magically disappear when you talk about foreign policy? It always needs to be bigger, stronger. You can always trust everything that it tells you. It never lies. It never screws up. We just have to kind of just fall in line. And Tom gave this great speech. I think a lot of people think it was his best speech ever. I know it's been called that many times. I will include a link to that as well. It's a 48-minute speech that he gave here in Los Angeles to an event that we did back in 2011. And I think it was absolutely fantastic. But anyways, let's get to George Washington. General freaking Washington. What did he have to say about foreign policy? And let's compare it with those people who claim that James Madison, quoting James Madison, was a commie, or restricting foreign policy to peace and commerce and things like that. You means that you're going to have China invade. Just absolutely nuts. So this from his farewell address in 1796. The anniversary of that is coming up next month. It was originally drafted by James Madison in 1792. I think Washington actually wanted to leave after one term. He was convinced to stay another because there was some turmoil going on. And at first, early on in the speech, he's talking about the benefits of union. The benefits of a union under the Constitution for the United States. And he says they must derive from union. He's talking about every part of the country, all the different states, the people of the several states. He said they must derive from union an exemption from those broils and wars between themselves, which so frequently afflict neighboring countries not tied together by the same governments. So one of the big benefits, one of the first benefits, is a prevention of war. The Union existed because they were opposed to having endless wars, which is what the old country, Europe, had. He says, hence, likewise, they will avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments, which under any form of government are inauspicious to liberty and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to Republican liberty. So you have union, so you don't have the neighboring wars of small states like they experienced all through history in Europe. And when you don't have all those wars, when you can live under a giant defense umbrella in peace, then you don't need each of those areas having giant military or overgrown military establishments. And if the country that is spending more than the next 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 countries combined on military isn't overgrown, there is no such thing. So people who reject that and say fake news or whatever garbage response they give us, they're just stupid. And we should really reject their views every single time they make them because they're absurd. George Washington, Revolutionary War hero, General Washington, told us that overgrown military establishments are always particularly hostile to Republican liberty. We're not talking Republican Party, we're talking about a Republican form of government. In that sense, he continues, it is that your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty. In that sense, preventing internal wars and preventing large military establishments. That's how it props up liberty, according to George Washington. And he says, and that the love of the one ought to endear you to the preservation of the other. Now, as far as overgrown military establishments, there was really no debate that military establishments were incredibly dangerous to liberty. Amongst the founders and old revolutionaries, they all thought it was dangerous. You don't ever find anybody saying, you can't go through the history and find an argument between Washington or somebody else, James Madison, and anyone saying, well, you're wrong about this. Large military establishments are not dangerous to liberty. They're fine. In fact, that's what protects our freedom. There was no debate. The only debate was no standing army versus small, supposedly manageable one. And for example, we've got Joseph Warren. Oh, no, let's go to James Madison first. James Madison, again, he wrote the original draft of Washington's farewell address. Here he is in 1795, the year prior to Washington's address in 1796. This is from a paper called Political Observations in April, and he put it this way, and you've heard me say this before if you've watched this show or listened to it. He says, of all the enemies to public liberty, all of them, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War, Madison writes, is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. He went on to point out that war also leads to an expansion of the discretionary power, that's how he put it, of the executive branch. And that there would be all kinds of offices, honors, emoluments, basically an expansion, a centralization of power in fewer and fewer hands. And he summed it up by saying, no nation, none, not some, not most, not land of the free, no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. I guess I got another piece highlighted here that I think is important. He says, those truths are well established. No one debated this. No one said, Madison, you're a commie, move to Cuba. No one said, go back to the old country, Madison. No one debated this. This was widely accepted, but he put it so forcefully. These truths are well established. They are read in every page which records the progression from a less arbitrary to a more arbitrary government, or the transition from a popular government to an aristocracy or a monarchy. So Madison was considered one of the greatest students of history at that time. He probably would, in comparison to most today, be one of the greatest students of history, better than most all of us alive. And he went through the history of this, and every time you could see a transition from a less arbitrary means less tyrannical. When it's arbitrary, that means it can exercise whatever power whenever it wants. So as governments through history move from less arbitrary to more arbitrary, less tyrannical to more tyrannical, this is what filled those pages. Wars, wars, armies, debts, taxes, and executive power. So again, as we're talking about overgrown military establishments, again, I mentioned that they didn't always just all agree that there should be no standing army. There was a difference on how much standing army, but they all recognized, all the founders and old revolutionaries recognized that standing armies were dangerous to liberty. No one was disagreeing with General Washington on this, but let's go through some highlights of a few other people. Another Revolutionary War hero, Joseph Warren. This quote that I have pulled up on the screen here. Standing armies always endanger the liberty of the subject. Always. Not sometimes, not once in a while, not most of the time, not everywhere except America, not when Republicans, just when Republicans are using them or Democrats or whatever. Doesn't matter. Always, always, always. Revolutionary War hero. This was his Boston Massacre oration. He gave an annual speech. He was so highly respected amongst the Sons of Liberty in Boston. This was his annual speech in March of 1775. And just weeks later, the man was killed in the Battle of Bunker Hill. So this is a hero. Everyone knows that Joseph Warren was a hero. He fought on the front line and he gave his life. He lost his life. Whether you think that was a good or bad thing, the fact is he has way more courage. He had way more courage and backbone to stand up for what he believed in than most of the chicken hawk pieces of garbage of today. We also have George Mason. He said, when once a standing army is established in any country, the people lose their liberty. This was in the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788. How about Elbridge Gerry? Oh, no, let's go right to Samuel Adams. A standing army is always dangerous to the liberties of the people. Always again. Now, he recognized that sometimes they were necessary. He was on board with sometimes having them. But he said, if you don't keep an eye on the fact that they're always dangerous, you're really missing something. This was an article or a letter to James Warren in 1776. Let's go back to George Washington. Now, I mentioned Elbridge Gerry. He was also making the same type of comments. I guess I don't have it up here on the screen. He called standing armies the bane of liberty in the first Congress in some debates. This is a guy that later became James Madison's vice president. So another highly respected person from the founding. Going back to George Washington, he put it this way in his speech. A very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. You might be thinking, well, why is he talking about the national debt? I know that's a problem. And in fact, a lot of the people who claim that they oppose huge national debts, even no matter which party is in power. Now, we tend to see a flip-flop on that. When one side makes large national debts, then it's a problem, but then it's okay when their own team does it. But let's say you're being consistent. You may be thinking, well, why are we talking about national debt? I thought you were talking about foreign policy. Well, let's ask George Washington, because he links the two together. He says one method of preserving strength and security and the public credit is to use it as sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace. You don't want to have a huge national debt. You don't want to ruin the public credit. And part of how you do that is by pushing for peace, cultivating, actively doing something and growing peace. He says, avoid likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertion in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. Now, he wasn't just saying we're never going to have a war. Obviously, he was the general, and he knew that type of thing was going to happen from time to time. But he recognized that you have to cultivate peace so you don't ruin credit. Now, this is just what Thomas Jefferson did when he was in office. It was Washington, Adams, then Jefferson, and Jefferson actually took Washington's approach and he put it into practice. Not saying that Jefferson was saying, well, what did Washington tell me to do? Because Jefferson had very strong views on this as well, and they were obviously pretty much on opposite sides of the spectrum at some points in their careers, although there was great respect there. And here from another article by Meharry, he says, for instance, Thomas Jefferson faced a huge national debt when he took office in 1801, from the election of 1800. But unlike his modern counterparts, he didn't grow it further. In fact, he significantly whittled down the debt. Again, what are you talking about debt for, Bolden, if you're talking about military and war and foreign policy? But how did he do it? He cut spending and applied savings to pay down the debt. Where did he cut? The federal workforce had only 130 employees. So Mike writes there wasn't a whole lot of fat to slice. So Jefferson went to part of the budget where the money was being spent. The military. Thomas Jefferson didn't grow the military. He didn't increase spending. He actually cut it back. Now, most of the time when people talk about cutting military budgets or military spending, they're only talking about a small percentage in the cut of the rate of the increase. They're not actually talking about a real cut from $1 trillion to $990 billion. They're talking about a cut. They go from $1 trillion today. The expected increase is $1.1 trillion. And they're saying, well, we'll just spend $1.05. And then everybody goes nuts that they're cutting and trying to decimate and hollow out the military. And China and North Korea and Iran, they're going to be at our shores making us all slaves because these people are so stupid. Jefferson argued that funding a standing army in peacetime was a colossal waste of money. Here's what he said in his first message to Congress. He says, sound principles will not justify our taxing the industry of our fellow citizens to accumulate treasure for wars to happen we know not when, and which might not perhaps happen but from the temptations offered by that treasure. In other words, you raise a bunch of taxes, you fund the military establishment, there becomes a temptation to use it. Thomas Paine at one point said taxes were not raised to carry on wars, but instead wars were raised to carry on the taxes. So back to George Washington. He says this, observe good faith and justice towards all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality. Morality enjoying this conduct. In other words, it encourages this conduct. If you're a moral person, you are cultivating peace and harmony with everyone. And he goes further. He says, the great rule of conduct for us in regards to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. There is no favored nation status under a George Washington administration, under a George Washington foreign policy. He's talking about having commerce with everyone possible. And I'll get to Jefferson's view on this in a little bit. Washington went further. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Now, he didn't say get rid of current alliances that we've already made agreements on. He says we're going to, continue the agreements we already have, but let's not make any new ones, and let's not make any of them permanent. Now, when we're talking about having morality, and George Washington talking about morals, Thomas Paine had a very similar approach. He took a very moral position. Here he is writing in The Crisis, December of 1776. This is the first of that series of papers, The Crisis #1. He said, not all the treasures of the world could have induced me to support an offensive war, for I think it murder. That old phrase from sports that says the best defense is a good offense, that does not apply morally to the founders when it comes to war and foreign policy, because a good offense, according to people like Thomas Paine, is murder. It's only defense which is okay and acceptable. Now back to Thomas Jefferson, again repeating a message. This was in his first inaugural, March 4th, 1801. The same message that George Washington had, just in a different phrase. He says, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. It's the same message that Washington. He says, observe good faith and justice towards all nations, cultivate peace and harmony. We need to have no permanent alliances. Let's have commercial relations. These are people who are, again, on the opposite ends of this political spectrum at that time. Jefferson was the real Federalist. Washington was a real Federalist compared to basically everybody today, but he was a big government guy at the time. But yet they had, again, the same views. And they're not the only two, but that's very representative of those two ends of the spectrum, the factions that they were part of. Now, even after hearing this, a lot of the same people who call us out as commies for quoting James Madison. They'll call us commies for quoting Washington or Jefferson or whatever. They don't care. They're just going to repeat some stupid talking point supporting the biggest government in history, supporting the biggest military empire in history. They'll tell us things like, well, but Jefferson didn't even follow this. You know, he went to war against the Islams, the Barbary states in North Africa back then, and he didn't even need congressional approval. He didn't care about any of this. But only someone who has never studied any of that history at all, none, and I mean zero, could make that claim. And I did an entire episode on this earlier this year, Thomas Jefferson versus the Barbary pirates. I will just point out that that comic book version is total garbage. It's a complete lie, and you have to really be making things up rather than reading what Thomas Jefferson did against the Barbary pirates. He was extremely restrained, and he followed his own approach on this as well. I encourage you to check out that episode if you're interested in learning. I will link to that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now, keep in mind, a lot of what I'm talking about are specific policy preferences. But these views from the founders weren't just policy preferences for that point in time in that current situation. And that's an argument we'll hear from some people that are at least thinking a little bit further. We have to understand, though, that George Washington specifically told us that one of the reasons for union, one of the main reasons for union, was to ensure that we had liberty. And how do you have liberty? You make sure you don't have war and you don't have overgrown military establishments. This was part of the constitutional structure in the first place. And that's how James Wilson also put it. He wasn't the only one. There was George Washington. This was in December of 1787, I believe, in the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention. And he put it this way: this system will not hurry us into war. It is calculated to guard against it. Again, Wilson was one of the biggest big government people of the time, and he was specifically saying that the system was created to guard against war. This was one of their main goals. If James Madison was saying war is one of the most dreaded threats to the public liberty, it leading to armies and debts and taxes, then certainly they wanted to create a system to prevent that, to prevent an individual from making decisions and taking the whole country to war whenever he or she wanted. Now, there's some irony about people who actually support this huge military establishment. They say, oh, they're defending our freedom, right? We're always hearing, that huge military, if you get rid of it, or if you even cut back to the level of some other countries on earth, then you're not going to be free. But John Taylor, this is a Jeffersonian protege, a great friend of Jefferson from the time. He wrote a book in 1822, Tyranny Unmasked, and he pointed out the irony of this view already back then. They already recognized the problem with this kind of garbage. He says, what is still worse, the pretext of defending nations by oppressive taxation defeats its object by its means. You can agree with me that taxation in and of itself is theft, is robbery, is stealing, or you can just say there's way too much taxation. But the idea of having these massive military budgets, having an establishment of an empire of military bases around the globe, larger than any country ever in the face of the planet, and having all the taxes and the debt and the money printing and the inflation that goes with it, this defeats the whole purpose. They're not defending our freedom at that point. They're defending what Thomas Paine said. Taxes were not raised to carry on the wars. The wars were raised to maintain those taxes. Taylor goes on. He says it weakens nations, having these large oppressive taxation. He says it weakens nations by indisposing the inhabitants of a country to defend it. And why should they, if this masterly policy already takes from them as much as they can pay? No conqueror or tyrant can take more. I mean, again, I can't say it enough. We're living under the largest government in the history of the world. This year alone, we're going to get close to $3 trillion in a budget deficit, more than double the worst in history, which was the last administration. And if we're talking about the worst in history on spending, and maybe it's not the worst in history on everyone as far as taxation, but is there anyone who's really going to come in and take more and debase the currency more than the Federal Reserve has done? And I don't even know if currency is the right thing. Look, if you claim to be a constitutional conservative, but find yourself getting really mad anytime you hear about the founders' advice for foreign policy or any type of limitation on your president engaging in war whenever he or she wants, then your approach to the founders and the Constitution is really no different than Nancy Pelosi's. Now it doesn't happen real often, but she's happy to talk about the Constitution and the founders' approach to the Constitution when it fits her political goals and her political narrative. But the rest of the time, she and all these other fake constitutionalist partisan hacks, they treat it like toilet paper. At the end of the day, the people who hate that we support the Constitution and the foreign policy of the founders are the real America haters. And if it's the opinion of someone who loves the biggest government in the history of the world, or even just one big part of it, versus the views of someone like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, Thomas Paine, James Wilson, James Madison, Samuel Adams, or any of the founders, for me, it's an absolute no-brainer. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it's educational. Man, this issue really riles me up. This and the really horrible support for the Second Amendment on the right, turning a blind eye to anything and everything constitutional as long as it's done by their team. Then again, when it comes to foreign policy, sometimes it doesn't matter which team, as long as it's more, bigger, more expansive, more executive power all the time. It really gets me pissed off. I hope it pisses you guys off as well. Alan Hughes asked, I thought Jefferson organized the Marines and sent them after the pirates. I encourage you, Alan, to check out that episode because it wasn't in a situation like it's claimed by people who have not studied history, that we don't need to follow the Constitution, that we don't need to have a limited, modest approach to things. I went through a pretty long overview of that, about 45 minutes as well. And Dave Benner, I actually cited Dave Benner's article on this. Dave, good to see you out here in the chat. He says, on this subject, see this article, Jefferson was highly deferential to Congress to the point where he wanted to exercise less power than they actually granted him. And I cited Dave's great research in that episode as well. MRGF says, how can the Federal Reserve push for a digital dollar? Says money is gold and silver. That's an interesting concept. Federal Reserve shouldn't even exist in the first place. Funky Euphemism says conservatives are just progressives driving the speed limit towards statism. I understand that approach, but I think it's actually incorrect. I've heard this many times from people that conservatives are going towards statism just like progressives, but it's at the speed limit. If we look at how things are playing out, when conservatives actually can do something, I think it actually goes the same speed, if not faster. I think a lot of times the progressives actually want or they ask for even bigger government in many areas. But when they're in power, the Republicans, the conservatives, sometimes act as a roadblock. So when you get a conservative or Republican president with a Democrat House, for example, it just, look at how the spending, for example, goes now. It's just insane. And again, if you're all going towards a cliff and we're talking trillions and trillions of dollars in debt and no change in surveillance or gun control or foreign policy, really, then what's the difference in the end? Again, I hope you guys found this interesting and educational. If you like the show, make sure to smash the like button. Subscribe, get notifications. Reviews on iTunes help out a lot. All these actions, when you're watching or listening on whatever platform, pretty much, when you take one of these actions, it triggers the algorithm of that platform and it tells that platform to show the program to more people. It's helping a lot. There's a bunch of people out here who are members who are putting their financial faith behind our work. I couldn't be more grateful for that support. Please don't feel pressured to join in with them and support us financially. If you're able to, though, it starts out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual 5-year lifetime memberships where we have these cool 110% 10ther cards because we are 10th Amendment, the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions and no excuses. I'll check out the comments a little bit later in the day. Feel free to leave some ideas for future episodes, ask questions, etc. I'll reply to as many as I can, or you can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a great day. I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.